Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to what is usually my most popular topic that I speak about for Trapper Nelson. In fact, I believe it was the first time I ever gave this presentation was for Palm Beach Gardens Historical Society back when they used to meet over on the church down in PGA. And I gave the presentation, except the room kept filling in with people. And it was the middle of the day, and more people kept streaming to the room, and we had to move to a larger room. And then that room filled up, and so we had to find another larger room. And eventually, a meeting was finally ending, and we could move over into take over this massive meeting room because we had it was 100 people that day that came to hear this. um, Trapper Nelson is just, he was a legend in his own lifetime, and only looms larger in the memories of people who knew him and hear stories of him. He is Vince, not Trapper John. Every time I hear someone ask about Trapper John, I go, MASH was a really popular TV show. It was still fashionable. All right, and for those of you who don't know me, I am the historian and collections manager for the Loxahatchee River Historical Society. We're the next historical society up the road. Uh, not just operating Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum, but over 50 years preserving the history of Jupiter to Cuesta, the Loxahatchee River area, which of course Trapper Nelson living on that, large in our history. So not just the lighthouse. But that's the way we get people to come in and they go, "Ooh, it's a lighthouse. It's pretty." And then they go, while they're there, we're like, "This includes a museum. Okay, I guess I'll go check that out. Surprise, history." This is the earliest photo we have of Vince Nelson, born Vincent Natalkowitz, up in Trenton, New Jersey. He is the big, gangly, little, somewhat awkward guy there on the right. His uncle is the guy on the left with his nephew on next to him. Phil Selmer the first, Phil Selmer the second. The Selmers will be throughout this story of Trapper's life. He was born to Polish immigrants from what is now Lithuania, Vilnius. His father's name was Kazimierz, or anglicized to Casimir. Um, Vincent, who is his namesake, was his uncle, his father's brother, who also immigrated over about the same time from the same area. Casimir was a potter and mason, a founding member of a St. Hedwig's Catholic Church in Trenton, New Jersey. Vince's mother died when he was only 6 years old. His father did remarry to another widowed Polish immigrant who had a son from her first marriage. The second marriage did not work out for either party. They would probably divorce in about a decade. No children added by the second marriage. Um, by all accounts, Vince didn't really get along with his stepmother, but considering dad didn't get along with his stepmom either, it makes sense. He had one older brother, Charles, or Charlie as he was usually known, and several sisters who he was very close with to various levels, who would be in touch with him for the rest of his life as he moved to Florida and went off on all of his travels. He would be geographically far from his family, but not distant. Siblings, cousins, nephews would visit him basically right up to this year he died. So he was not detached from his family. Um, he did not care too much for Trenton or New Jersey and wanted to get out and see some more of the country, especially the wilds of it. And here's a photo of slightly later Vince in the 1930s visiting his family up in New Jersey. That's his father there, and then his nephew, Phil Selmer II. They're up on one of the beaches in New Jersey. He went out west with his brother Charlie and probably some other friends from Trenton. They went trapping for animals out in Arizona and places like that. He was in Colorado, California, Mexico. There is an amusing story that he, while trapping near the border, accidentally strayed over into Mexico and was arrested by the federales on suspicion of some kind of smuggling or gun running. And then he proceeded to, with his voracious appetite, to eat them out of house and home. And they finally, just after a few days of it, said, just get her across the border and don't come back. Not, I don't think Mexican prisons are really all you can eat buffets. But I think that's probably a good example of a story, the kind of story that Vince probably told himself about his to people. He was the kind of guy who'd like to spin a few yarns in his day, probably exaggerated a little bit of his exploits out west. They were trapping otter, fox, uh, coyotes, all sorts of animals out west for their fur. We do have some photos from that trip. Um, Here's some more with them, with some birds, getting a beaver or muskrat there out on a lake. He's actually smiling in that one photo. He doesn't smile in a lot of his photos. As you can see, his physique is already, he's got that look that would make him legendary. Although already out there in the Old West, a lot of good build and a lot of manual labor. He comes to Jupiter maybe in 1929, maybe 1931. The details are a little fuzzy depending on who's telling the story. Um, we have some early photos from a photo album that belonged to him that appeared to show him before he settled in here permanently. They had a camp on the beach and did, while they were doing some trapping in the area, came down on the railroad. One story is that he came down, he rode the rails like a hobo, and it was just common in the time, especially with the Depression sitting in. And he saw the river and just thought it was so beautiful they had to hop off and check the place out. Mind you, if you're trapping, you have to have actual traps, which isn't easy to haul along in a sack while you're hoboing on a railroad. So maybe that was just kind of a scouting trip, and then they came back later with the car and the traps and the equipment. But he found that the trapping down here was pretty good. It was a very sparsely settled area. The entire Jupiter area, easily less than 1,000 people. It's a small farming community in the 1930s. Um, very, very tiny, a lot of space to go out there and hunt and trap. So he liked the area quite a lot. In 1931, he is camping with some fellow trappers down about where the Jupiter Beach Hilton or Jupiter Beach Resort is now today. They're south of Jupiter Beach, and there's a couple trappers nearby, separate from him, but he's there with his brother Charlie and a friend of his from Trenton named John Dykes. Now, John is Vince's age, probably went through school together. Charlie's a little older. And Charlie, who we think is this photo here on the right-hand side, we're not entirely certain. This photo album is not really well identified in the photos. Um, Charlie was a little bit of a hothead, and there was some tension. And one day, Vince is out checking his traps, and Charlie has decided he's had enough of John, and he's just wants this guy to get lost. So he tells him, take your stuff, take your cut of our profits, and I'm going to go into my tent for a bit, and when I come back out here, if you're still here, I'm going to shoot you dead. And John is thinking, okay, Vince is, I know this guy's a bit of a hothead, he's pissed about something, he'll blow up, where I'm going to sit here quietly fixing my breakfast. And a little time goes by, Charlie comes back out, John is still there, and Charlie pulls out a gun and shoots him. And then he goes, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So he takes their car and goes down to West Palm Beach and turns himself into the police. There is a trial for murder, surprisingly swift justice in those days. Probably a lot fewer cases on the docket back then. Vince testifies against his brother at the trial. There are a lot of stories about the trial that get into a little lurid, and claims of, sentencing, threats from the sentencing hearing against Vince that I'll come back and get you for backstabbing your own kin type of stuff. If it happened, it's not reported in the newspapers. I reached out to the clerk of court to say, hey, do you have any files about a murder case that was back in 1931 here? And they didn't have any records for it. So the real specifics of it, again, probably a little bit exaggerated in the tellings and the imagination. But one way or the other, Charlie goes off for murder to the state penitentiary up in Rayford. And Florida State Penitentiary was not a fun place to be back then. It was, they all had chain gangs. You were going to probably be doing hard time and hard labor. Um, Vince goes back up to New Jersey with his family and does some work up there for a little bit to make some money, but he really liked that Jupiter area in the Loxahatchee River, and so he decides he is going to come back there and finally maybe settle down a little bit. He goes up the Loxahatchee River Northwest Fork as far as you can really navigate in a boat then or now. And there's a little camp of some kind up there that somebody else had up there with a little orchard of some sort. And we don't know exactly who, but the guy wasn't around anymore, probably had abandoned the place from the Depression. And Vince just kind of squats there and makes it his own for a while and will eventually gain legal ownership of the property. He's got to be industrious early on. He doesn't have a lot of money or resources, so you can see, from the early camp out there, he's doing, palmetto roof, palmetto walls, some sheet metal, probably driftwood, old uh, crates and planks and things, just kind of cobbling something together. But he really likes the area up there. There's plentiful game. He can set out his trap lines. He can fish. Needs a shower. He can jump in the river. He's big enough that the alligators are scared. Um, he likes the area so much he stays permanently and will start to develop the camp a little bit. And people were already coming up the Loxahatchee River to picnic or fish or whatnot, and they hear that there's this guy up there, and they come up and see, and they go, "Oh wow, this guy!" The Johnny Weissmuller films, the Tarzan films, were big at this time, and here's this guy living in the woods who's like a living embodiment of Tarzan. And people are just enthralled by that. And he's got animals in cages that he's captured before he skins them or sells them to a zoo through the, take them into town in a cage and put them on the train to send up north to a zoo. Um, it's just exotic. And people are driving in if they don't get stuck in the dirt road, getting back there, or they're coming in by boat. And Trapper's a savvy guy. He's got a very basic, education, but he realizes he's savvy and he realizes, if people want to come see me, hang around, picnic, slap a quarter in my hand. We call it good for using my picnic grounds. See the animals. Maybe I sell them a baby raccoon or a baby alligator, an air plant, various souvenirs of that might be popular. Um, and make sure when lunchtime comes around, a little bit of the picnic basket contents might go into my hand. Um, so just a little bit more about Vince as a person. One of the best things I ever heard about him was one of our former lighthouse volunteers who'd grown up here in this area. He had the biggest hands of any man I've ever met. Vince was 6'4", it should be 6'2", although sometimes reported as 6'4", probably looked 6'4". He was about 195 when he gets to Jupiter. He'll be by World War II up to about 215 pounds, probably all 20 of that extra weight is muscle. Later, he'll put on a little bit more weight, and probably later in life, he's about 240. Uh, he made the ladies swoon, but he was reportedly a little shy and awkward sometimes around them. His looks and his personality didn't entirely line up. Um, like I said, limited education, but smart, followed the real estate market. Family describes him as kind of a math whiz. He would read the Wall Street Journal. He read magazines. Not really cracking open, classic literature or anything like that, but trying to keep informed. Uh, Kind of introverted, liked having company, but also liked it when company left. Didn't show his emotions a lot, tend to be a bit stoic, as you'll see in the photos. Like I said, very rarely smiling. Um, Rarely, if ever, drank, never smoked, chopped a cord of wood every day for exercise. Had a legendary appetite. There's one story he went into town to the local restaurant, and there was only one other person at the restaurant that night. It was the inspector from the lighthouse. And dessert rolls around, and the proprietor brings out a pie and cuts a piece, gives it to the inspector, and hands the rest of the pie to Trapper. Uh, Vince is almost always clean shaven. I think we literally have one photo of him with a beard, which we'll see here, and there's a specific reason for that, for why he grew the beard that one time. Um, some people thought he didn't like children, but other people describe him as patient and friendly to children, especially the ones in his family. Uh, Probably he was one of those people who liked well-behaved children. Um, Someone he's been described as someone who didn't raise his voice much, but someone who didn't need to. He just had that presence and that force in his voice that he could say something and you knew when you had screwed up and you weren't going to screw up again like that. For trapping, it was otters, birds, raccoons, foxes, bobcats, occasionally a Florida panther. Um, he would catch snakes and turtles. Sometimes when people would catch snakes and bring it to him and sell it to him. He did quit trapping alligators after a few years. He was friends with John and Bessie Du Bois in Jupiter, and they said to him, "You know, alligators are getting kind of scarce these days. Whatever money you can make from selling their skins, you can make a lot more by having a tourist attraction with gators in your pen and gators in your river." And he took that advice to heart. Um, Kind of a complex person, like I said, not too emotionally outwardly emotional, um, but maybe felt a little stronger inside. The introvert, but liked company, but liked it when it left. Trapped animals, but was very concerned about being humane about them. He didn't. He would go out and check his traps first thing in the morning, try to get the animals not just to preserve the fur, but so they didn't suffer in the traps. Uh, didn't use the claw traps. He usually just metal traps that would just catch the leg in there. Um, was very concerned about not leaving traps out if he didn't need them. The metal traps, by the way, any normal person would actually have to get some kind of pliers or something to open them up. Vince just go down there and open them right up on his own with his bare hands. Um, if he was going to be, if there was a spokesperson that you could pull out of any point in time for the company up in Stewart that called BM, their slogan is "Be a Man, Buy Land." I think you'd probably time travel and borrow Vince for a little commercial shoot. Here's another shot of Trapper's early camp again. You know, the Palmetto shacks, not too far off from some of the early pioneers in the area. Very basic layout. The log pens there are for holding animals, especially the open-topped ones, especially for alligators. Alligators don't climb too well usually. Occasionally see fence, they'll go over fences on YouTube, but and some, again, just really, this is a cooking shack here on the right. You got some of the animal cages he would keep animals in, some of the smaller ones. He actually invented he would make his own little cages that he would use. When he had an animal in a snare trap out there, he would go out there and, put a snare on their neck and then let them out of the trap and kind of pull them into a box that he could, release them from the other end. Um, Protect himself and the animal. So this first one of his early shelters is here on the right with the tar paper, and then you've got two additional cabins there in the background that he built in the 1930s, often used for guests that were staying at the camp. He will replace those later once he gets a little more money. It's one of the ways we can actually tell some of the photos apart from when they were taken, not just how trappers dressed, but a lot of times how the camp looks and what the buildings are. I mentioned the alligators, so a couple different examples is there's a log pen with one of the alligators in it. We've got a couple of photos. People would sit on the pen sometimes and dangle their feet in a little carelessly. So he did later on put lids over the alligator cages as well. The early on, the bobcats and the raccoons and things like that were usually kept in crates, and then he'll see a little later he built some shelters, some of which are still there today, that had a chain link fence on the front and then like a log enclosure around it to give them a little bit more space and keep people from being foolish with them. He loved snakes. He loved to walk around camp with a big indigo snake draped over his shoulders, and could be a little mischievous. If he saw someone, especially one that seemed a little skittish about the snakes, when they weren't paying attention, he might walk up behind them, lift the snake off and onto that person's shoulders. Um, especially some of the more skittish women. Uh, a little bit of a prankster. You can also see, besides most of the photos he's posed with snakes are the indigo snakes, which are like actually to eat other venomous snakes. They're not harmful themselves. They're pretty rare these days. But in the middle there, you can see one of his rather large rattlesnakes he's handling. He only had one mishap with the rattlesnakes. In 1937, there was they were filming some stuff at his camp, and he got a little careless with one of the snakes, and it bit him in the thumb. He had to go to the hospital for that. He would have a scar on his thumb for the rest of his life. Lost the nail on the thumb as well. Even has to mentions that on his draft card when he's listing identifying marks. We'll actually see in the next. There's one other photo we have from that time period. Is actually hand is bandaged. People would also like people would sell him snakes. It was usually rattlesnakes that they would catch, especially if they were able to get a big one and sell it to him. Either the skins or we could sell it to the snake farms that would milk the venom to make anti-venom. He had a dog when he arrived with the lovely name of Bozo. And that photo on the right there, you can see he's got his hand bandaged from the snake bite. He really liked the dog, and it was the only dog he ever had. And when it passed away, he never got another one. And the reasoning behind that, according to his family, was the dog got heartworms, being out there in the woods and so forth. And there wasn't medicine for heartworms back then that you could give a dog, and the dog suffered really badly from that experience before it died. And he just never wanted to subject another beloved pet to that sort of thing. Here is he doing a bit of the Tarzan look there with some animal skins. One lady there immediately next to him also wearing some animal furs. Um, Especially in the 30s, I think was when he was mostly doing the animal fur thing to really play up the Tarzan angle. By the 40s, after World War II, Tarzan's not quite as much in the popular conscience, but he played it up. He was willing to do an act, but he did not like it if you thought the act was who he really was. He's living in the woods, he's an outdoorsman, but he's not a bumpkin, he's not a savage, and he really would get resentful to visitors who might mistake the act for not being an act. Also interesting there on the side is a sea turtle skull perched on one of the posts. And it wasn't just tourists that was coming up here to see him from Jupiter Island and Palm Beach Island. This is a photo from senior skip day at Jupiter. And a photo that surfaced of JFK coming up from Palm Beach when he was a kid to visit Trappers Camp. And this is something, just someone was browsing around on the JFK Presidential Library website and went, the background on this photo looks a little familiar, and posted it on one of the local Facebook groups. And sure enough, that's unmistakably one of Trapper's early palm cabins there, right in the background, and time period fits and everything. This is a photo that you may have seen if you ever go to Park Avenue Barbecue. Rare occasion of Trapper in a shirt. The four children in the front there, we don't know who the other random guests are, but the four children in the front we know are all the children of John and Bessie Du Bois. And Bessie told the story of exactly why this photo was taken. In 1934, her father, their grandfather, rather tragically burned to death in a house fire. And most of the town was going to be at the funeral for this because small town, everybody knew everybody. And they said, why subject our young children, who I think probably none of them were quite 10 years old at that point, why subject them to a depressing, sad day? We'll take them up to Vince. Vince will take care of them at the camp, and they'll have a happy day instead. So this photo was taken to commemorate that. Have to provide some bathroom facilities out there in the woods. The outhouse that they had there, mostly for the benefit of the visitors, was just like a little palmetto shack, no foundation or floor. So once the outhouse was needed to be moved, it was easy to just pick it up and dig it. You dug a new hole, a couple dozen feet away, picked it up, moved it over, and put it down. This is a guy named Joe Farrell. He was a runaway from New York City who came down here and was kind of loosely adopted by one of the local families as a teenager. And he ended up spending about a year living up at Trapper's Camp as well. And he thought they were quite good friends. Some people apparently referred to him as Little Trapper. He helped out at the camp, checking the trap lines, feeding the animals, things that make Vince's life a little easier. Joe, after a little while, he turned 18 and he decided he was going to go join the military. was in the Navy for quite a while. After he retired, he came back to visit Vince. So this would have been late 1950s. And as the story Joe tells it, and it opens up a little, kind of a sad part of Trapper's life. He comes back and he's chatting with Vince, and Vince goes, Joe is like, I have bought some land right next to you, Vince. We'll be neighbors one day when I get some money, I can build a home on it. And he went, you own some land next to me, Joe. Didn't you tell me your brother married an Asian woman? That means, and you're not married. If something happens to you, your brother's going to inherit the land, isn't he? Then I'm going to have an Asian neighbor. Like one of them fellers we were just fighting in the war not too long ago. Trapper, unfortunately, was a bit prejudiced, which is ironic for the son of an immigrant who saw people mistreat his own father, who did not speak English as a first language, and saw people mistreat his father and as an immigrant, and then himself ended up prejudiced against a different group of people. You'll also sadly notice that throughout these photos, we have hundreds of photos of Trapper's camp and the visitors and Trapper there. The photos are mostly in black and white. The guests are 100% white. The black residents knew that they were not welcome at the camp from Trapper. It's it's sad, but one of Trapper's best friends, besides the Du Bois family, was a guy named Frank Leckleitner. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who everyone knows as Captain Frank, to the point where if you read the book The Loxahatchee Lament, as pioneers are waxing poetic about the pioneer days of Jupiter, you'll come away going, well, everyone loved this Captain Frank, but no one explained who the heck he was. Frank was a bachelor like Vince, came down here to Jupiter a little bit before Vince did, had a home on Lake Worth Creek in the Intercoastal Waterway, and was a boat captain. He would take people out to sea, up the Indian River, up the Loxahatchee River, a charter boat, people, tourists fishing and hunting and things like that. He had his own little picnic ground up the river as well. Like the outdoors, like to fish. I think they had, they were both guys in the Jupiter for the same reason. Not liking people a whole lot and enjoying the outdoors a lot. Captain Frank, as you can see in this photo, was a habitual pipe smoker. We only have like 3 photos of the guy, and every one of them he's smoking a pipe. This would lead to him getting throat or lung cancer and dying of cancer in 1960, which hit Vince pretty hard emotionally, we think, and it led to his kind of fears about cancer and contributing. It was around the same time that he was closing his camp to the public, and so probably contributed to its kind of a less than stellar state of mind that it put him in. Another interesting aspect of Vince is that people saw this guy and they went, wow, this guy's a big slab of muscle. We got to put this guy in boxing matches. So they had a lot, amateur fights down at the American Legion Hall in West Palm Beach. So they get Vince to come down there and box. And let me find my note here. December of 1934, they have a guy from New York named Tony Guerra, and Vince is TKO'd in the first round. And they go, well, we found out that this Tony guy actually had a little bit of amateur experience. This was Vince's first boxing match of any kind. He never had no experience before, not really any training. We're going to find another guy who's a true amateur, never had a boxing match before either. And they find a guy named Tom Terry out of Pahokee. And 2 weeks later, they have a second match for Trapper. KO'd in the first round. For all his muscle, as Bessie Wilson, Du Bois put it, Trapper had a glass jaw. Trapper also becomes ubiquitous for his pith helmet. You can see here, got it after a couple years after he came to the camp, it seems, and would wear that thing pretty religiously for the rest of his life. Also, another story from the 30s. In 1938, there was a goat explosion that made the front page of the Stuart News. Someone's goat farm near Trapper's just mysteriously blew up one day. And the man had been having a bit of a dispute with Trapper about access through his land to get to Trapper's camp. And he immediately pointed the finger at Vince, and I know who blew it up. And Vince immediately, called up his friends on Jupiter Island and a guy named Soccer Co, no relation to your co, um, was represented him in court and basically said, you don't have any evidence of it that Vince was responsible, and so the charges ended up getting dropped for lack of evidence. Family thought that Vince probably did blow up the guy's goats. Right before World War II, Vince chops down a bunch of this pine forest right behind his house, right behind his camp, and builds two cabins. One for himself, and then one that'll be a guest cabin to replace these early palmetto shacks. This is Phil Summer II helping out with the chopping the wood. And then here we are with the frame up. That axe there, a double-headed axe, we believe, is the one that, according to oral history, Vince had that was so heavy that basically nobody else could chop it, but he would use it. He could chop with ease with it. So they build the cabins. There's actually, if you look very closely at the concrete foundation of the cabins, the one on the east side that was Vince's has the date in them marked in there, and the other cabin has a later date from when they originally built them down to the ground, and then he found that the termites were getting into the pine wood, and so he jacked the cabins up and poured a concrete foundation for both of them, and so they marked the date on the other one from when they poured that. And that's the guest cabin has a hurricane log on it as well. So Trapper is the ladies' man. We certainly have some photos of him getting cozy with some of his female visitors at the camp. Certainly made the women swoon, but probably did not see as much action or ruin as many marriages anywhere near as much as some people think. He did get married once and quickly came to regret it. Woman named Lucille G. This is the one photo we have of her. The thought was that Vince had gotten married largely to try to avoid getting drafted for World War II. With more records coming available through places like Ancestry.com, it turns out that the story was backwards. He got married because he got drafted. He gets his draft notice and then goes and gets Hitch, and it's probably a current girlfriend, Lucille, and he needs someone to take care of that camp while he's away in the war. She probably quickly tired of being at this place in the woods with no electricity, no plumbing. She's wearing high heels out here in this photo, so probably not quite the rough and tumble woman that he needed to run a camp like that. She seems to have disappeared in 1943, and he divorced her via notice in the newspaper. She had actually been married once before, and after she would work at a place called the 19th Hole down in Lake Park, would get married a third time after Vince, and then divorced him, and then tried to get married a fourth time in the 50s, and she couldn't, because it turned out she didn't have a clean divorce from Vince, and possibly not her first husband for that matter. Interestingly enough, though, she would then come back to try to get a cut of Trapper's estate later, because hey, you didn't properly divorce me, you still owe me money, because I'm kind of still your wife. And I'm like, well, if you were kind of still his wife, how were you kind of trying to marry other people? Right after World War II, so during World War II, he gets drafted. He goes to basic training up in Camp Blanding, and then he gets sent to Keesler Air Force Base over in Biloxi, Mississippi, to train as an aviation mechanic. Not the first thing you'd think of to put Vince into. And he suffers some kind of injury there during training, and has to have an operation on his thigh. He eventually recovers all right. He doesn't develop a limp from it, but he finds the experience so unpleasant that it puts him off of doctors basically for the rest of his life. Somebody said that Vince once said he's not going to let anybody cut him ever again. But he's not doing too well there in this whole Army adjustment. But meanwhile, the U.S. Army has come in and bought up all this land, including a little bit of Trappers, on the north side of the Loxahatchee River, going out to US 1, and they're going to turn this 10,000 plus acres into the Southern Signal Corps School, or Camp Murphy. And there's some people from Jupiter Island involved in helping on the special services side of things, and one of a particularly influential individual, Joseph Reed, pulls a few strings with his buddies in the government and gets Trapper transferred over to Camp Murphy. And Trapper will spend most of his army service doing security and pest control at Camp Murphy because you've got this camp of 5,000 people in the woods and wilds of Florida with snakes and scorpions and angry raccoons rifling around in the garbage and goodness knows what else. And it's not exactly like if you need security, Trapper shows up and you look at that guy, he goes, "Yes, sir. I'm going to follow whatever you tell me to do, sir." Trapper liked it because he could, be there near his camp and everything. He knew the land well, but you can make a lot of people into infantrymen. Nobody knew the land and the critters better than Vince, so this was really the best place he could be to contribute to the war effort. Sadly, his personnel record is one of the many World War II personnel records that was lost in a fire in 1973 out in the St. Louis National Archives. So we don't know most of the specifics other than when he was enlisted and when he was discharged and a couple mentions in the newspaper. Have to look closely through the Camp Murphy newspapers as well to see when he's mentioned in there. I know one story about him seeing like a 6-foot rattlesnake and trying his best to capture it, but finally had to pull out his pistol and shoot the thing because it was just too ornery. Another time that they said Vince must have been feeling a little bad because he only ate half a pie at the cafeteria today. So after the war, he comes back to his camp and he really is trying to take his business acumen up to the next level. He's got business cards printed. He's got a series of 4 postcards of his cabin, of him with a big cypress tree, of his alligator pit, of him here on the dock with his holding an alligator, trying to draw people in. Come see his camp. Come make him some more money. So how did he get all of this land that he had? Common story was that he was getting it all through tax sales in the 1930s. People were defaulting on their mortgage payments or their taxes during the Great Depression, and he would be swooping in with his money made off of tourists and animal sales and buying it all up. Turns out there's less truth to that than we once thought. So he did get his property around his camp. That was the first piece of property he actually owned free and clear after 4 years. He did get that from a tax sale. He also got tax sale for some land over by near what's now the Jonathan Dickinson State Park boat ramp. And he lost that to Camp Murphy. And then in the middle of World War II, he gets all the land along the river that would end up being his. There's a guy from Jupiter Island named C.D.S. Clarkson who had bought up most of the river corridor and the Kitchen Creek corridor as well. And his idea was to log cypress. And some people tried to talk him out of it. They thought the cypress really wasn't worth as much as Clarkson did, and they wanted to preserve the river's beauty, and they figured that clear cutting all the cypress would ruin that. He couldn't talk. He wanted to. He'd say, "Sure, buy me out with enough money, and I'll not log the cypress." And people are like, "It's not worth what you think it is. We're not going to give you that much money." So there was some logging right before World War II and before Camp Murphy. But once Camp Murphy happens, Clarkson loses a bunch of his land and gives up on this whole logging enterprise, and he flips a bunch of the river corridor that didn't go to Camp Murphy. He flips it to Trapper for a mere $10, and whatever other valuable considerations were involved according to the deed. Probably some little handshake deal on something else in there that we'll probably never know. And then after the war, between 1948 and 1953, Trapper is just buying up bits of land around him from ranches and things like that to expand. Basically, most of the Jonathan Dickinson State Park that is south of the Loxahatchee River is former Trapper land. The main exception, there is a little section up there that was owned by a lady named Alice Delamar from Palm Beach Island. And she had it as her little picnic grounds and so forth. And she gave it to the Audubon Society, who did eventually give it to the park. And a small portion owned by Audrey Pennick Lieb, who did eventually, she claimed she was going to donate it to the park, and then she ended up never doing that and selling it when it got sold when she died, and the park had to do a little land swap to acquire it. So this is the camp after World War II, view from the guest cabin looking over to his garage, which isn't there anymore. He had quite a setup in that garage with the help of his Selma relatives coming down from New Jersey. A lot of tools there. They could put his Jeep up. He got some World War II Jeep, surplus Jeeps. Um, could work on them. Had equipment there for cutting wood, for building traps and cages and buildings on structures there at the camp. Uh, Here is Trapper in his more of his post-war look with the pith helmet and the khaki shorts, and in front of one of the animal cages. You can look really closely. It looks like there's some alligators in there. But these are the kind of cages he built after the war, especially after the flood. He started building a couple of them right after the war, and then there was a bad flood in 49 from one of the hurricanes, and he really decided it was time to upgrade the animal cages. After one of his alligators went on swimming down the river. He had to go down there and recapture it, and it was his alligator Stumpy that was missing a leg, so it was a bit of a tourist attraction for him. This is the dock there, the original dock on the river. He had to vary height on the dock because the river is still tidal up there. So depending on what time of day you got there, it depended on where you need to pull up to the dock and get off your boat. Had a rope swing there. Uh, Had to scare the gators off occasionally, but didn't stop people from swimming. And then he had his boathouse, had a whole chain hoist system there. He could lift his boats up out of the water if he needed to do repairs on the hull. After World War II, he built a much longer dock there, going from around the boathouse over to the rope swing and then around the corner and off into a little cypress swamp around the bend. He called it the Boardwalk to Palm Beach. He also pulled an old yacht all the way up the river and docked it just past the boathouse. And he stripped some material off of it for use of the camp. And then it was sort of like a floating cabin that you could rent out there. Some picnickers in the 1950s, trappers smiling. They probably just gave him something from their picnic lunch. You can see just what the picnic shelters he had there. You know, some very basic cut lumber, and he put thin metal tops on them just so they were easy to clean off. Originally had little sort of palmetto, almost like cheeky tile style roofs on them. And then he ended up building one very large picnic shelter. That's the one that's still standing there today, which he called his cheeky shelter. He had two lofts up there, and the lofts could be used for camping guests, especially if he had like a Boy Scout and Girl Scout troop that would come out there to camp. And the girls would camp into one side up there in the loft, and the boys would be in the other loft, and then he'd take the ladders down so that they stayed in their own lofts. Also, so they didn't come down and the boys didn't come down and mess with any of his animals at night. He started keeping goats after World War II for tax reasons. Had 3 goats, because apparently was the minimum it had to qualify him as a goat farmer. And we'd heard this story. We have this picture here of the goat to know that they really were there. And then the 1950 census came out just a couple of years ago, and lo and behold, Vince Nelson's on the census, listed with occupation, not trapper, not tourist attraction operator, farmer. Trapper was a shrewd businessman. Some photos of the inside of the guest cabin. He's got some of his Selmer relatives down here to visit. You know, they've got tablecloths, they've got salt shakers and coffee cups and jars there on the wall. They had it was rustic living. Well, there was certainly no air conditioning, but it was not it was not the log cabins of the Wild West of yore. Certainly better living than the pioneers. He had a water tank there. He pumped water for the site. They did eventually get a generator, in part for his refrigerator. There's some concern that because of his trapping and skinning of animals, some of the stuff he would use formaldehyde on some of his preservings, stripping the flesh off of a rattlesnake, and then you'd sell the skull with the big fangs to tourists as a thing like that, or bird talons. Some of the formaldehyde he used for things like that, and some of the other chemicals that it may have contaminated his groundwater and contributed to some of his health issues. The main way, besides people driving or coming in their boat to get to trappers after World War II, is from Bruce Collier down there in West Palm Beach. He made a daily trip up on the Jungle Cruise. And it was running from right after World War II all the way up until literally the day Trapper closed his camp to the public. Some photos of Vincent in his later years. As you can see, his physique is starting to decline a little bit with age. The photo on the right there with the beard, we know the story behind that one. It was 1959. It was the first Jupiter centennial, as it were. Um, People thought that the lighthouse was 100 years old. They were technically off by a year, but didn't stop them. They had a big old Jupiter lighthouse centennial celebration right there about where Utiki is today, whole big fairgrounds and everything. And as part of this year-long celebration, all the men in town were supposed to grow beards. He famously arrested Perry Como at his home when he came back from filming his TV show, and it's like, oh, Perry, you don't have a beard. We're gonna put you in the stocks downtown. So Vince got in the spirit of things and grew out a beard for probably the only time in Jupiter. And here on the middle with the rare color photo from very late in life, you can see he's kind of dressed in his army fatigues he would use, and he's got these black boots. He wore, all around camp, he wore the moccasins like he's wearing in the dock photo there on the right, but the middle photo, those boots, is what he'd usually wear if he was going out to check his traps and away from camp. And they were big snake boots, and so he wanted to make sure he didn't get bit by a cottonmouth or a rattlesnake or anything, but he slipped them down the side. And one time, one of his family members there, it's like, Vince, why you got the big cut down the side of the boots? It's like, you'll see. So they go out there, they start working the traps. It's summer. And quickly, the guy's seeing that his boots are filling up with sweat. So the slice down the side was so that the sweat could drain out rather than pool in there and be sloshing around as he's checking the traps. This is one of his great nephews, Richard Selmer. This is after the camp had closed to the public. His family were still visiting, along with a very few select choice friends. Um, in 1960, Vincent had some issues with sanitation, that he wasn't, properly the county thought he wasn't properly dealing with the waste from his animals and wasn't providing proper bathroom facilities for guests. He built the bathrooms that are still there today at the camp as part of dealing with that. But the bigger problem, based on his letters home, he was really tired of teenagers. And he just had one too many times. He was just sick of dealing with wrangling these darn kids these days. Closed his camp to the public in 1960. Family still visited. John and Bessie Du Bois could still visit. But, other than his family, like, you wrote to him, you said, Vince, I'd like to come visit you. And he said yes or no. And he met you at the gate. If you just showed up unannounced, there would be a gate across the road, and he'd be in the bushes with a shotgun, suggesting that you might go somewhere else. He shut down logs across the river and blocked the river. He put up signs that the private property keep out. And as you can see here, danger landmines. Well, it turns out there really were landmines, not secret surplus that he'd stolen from Camp Murphy. He had a few extra bear traps that he strategically placed to make sure that if you weren't supposed to be there, you might not be going very far. Particularly, he'd set them out near his pineapple patch where he'd been digging. He at one point had a theory that the Battle of the Loxahatchee might have been fought there, and if he could only find some evidence of it, the state might want his land more, or the tourists might be more inclined to visit. But then people were like, oh, the pineapple patch might be where Trapper has buried his gold. And so they wanted to keep people out of there. There was no gold, by the way. This is the last photo ever taken of Trapper Nelson. Well, this was about 6 months before he died. That's his great niece, Cindy, there. She was interviewed a couple months back by a news station back in October, I think. You could find a little interview with her on the internet. As Trapper got older, he took to sleeping out under his cheeky shelter more often in a hammock. He was starting to have some health issues. He was using a catheter for months to urinate because he had bladder problems. He'd had some tax issues. He had to sell off some land he acquired in Tequesta, which is where Riverbend Country Club and Turtle Creek are now. He'd been kind of under the gun from it because he was financially, he had to do a very sketchy mortgage that was going to ruin him if he couldn't pay it off in time, and he had to end up closing a deal he found was a little unfavorable, but at least it stabilized his finances. and he still had his land all around his camp. Um, but he's concerned about his health. He's not feeling well. His appetite is in decline. He's worried that he has cancer. One of his doctors in town said he was just outright paranoid about the possibility of cancer. So in on July 30th of 1968, 8 years after his camp has been closed, um, he's got an appointment to meet somebody out in town, to old buddy from when the camp was open, to come visit him. And the guy shows up on time, and he waits and he waits, and Trapper never shows up. And the meeting place is over at John Du Bois Fish Camp. And John, who's known Trapper since the 30s, one of his best friends in the Jupiter area, goes, "This is odd. Trapper is not the kind of person that misses an appointment like this." So John, being one of the few people that had a gate to his key to Trapper's gate, drives up this dirt road to Trapper's camp, goes in there. It's all too quiet, and there is Trapper dead on the ground. And this is long before cell phones. So John's got to hop in his truck, drive all the way back to the fish camp, call up, this is over the county line, so he's got to call up the Martin County Sheriff's Department all the way up in Stewart, have a deputy meet him at the fish camp, lead him back out to the camp where Trapper's dead. And according to the coroner's report, and verified by at least one deputy who I've talked to that was there, Trapper is found face down under his cheeky shelter, not far from his hammock. His arms are under his body. The flesh has been eaten off from a lot of his head and his arms. His trusty shotgun is lying at his feet, with the butt either right under his ankle or just to the side of it. There was a little bit of discrepancy as what people could remember. He had been killed. There was an autopsy performed. It was not performed at the camp, as is sometimes said, but it was performed up. They took him up to Martin Memorial Hospital, although they did autopsy him outside because of the condition of his body. He was clearly killed by a point-blank gunshot wound to his chest from his own shotgun. It went almost straight in. There was no exit wound. It is not buckshot, as you would expect from a shotgun wound. It was a solid slug that he had in there. The other barrel of the shotgun had not been fired, and that one did contain buckshot. His keys were lying on a nearby table. His cabin was still locked. There were still 3 loaded guns inside. There was no sign that anything had been stolen from the camp. The coroner estimated that Trapper had been dead for 5 days, which is plausible since he'd last been seen 7 days earlier. Trapper had kept chickens, and he also kept a very ill-tempered African relative of the chicken called the guinea fowl. And he had a flock of them that served as his little alarm system at the camp. They would raise an unholy ruckus if anything strange came by, any unfamiliar person, any wild animal. And these chickens and guinea fowl, as Trapper's dead body is lying there, they went, the maggots are moving in, tasty. And they'd clambered all over Trapper's body, and they'd pecked away at him. It was the summer. It had rained at least once since Trapper had died. There are no prints. There are no identifiable tracks in the sand around Trapper's body. There's no marks on the gun. Some people go, "Oh, that's suspicious. Someone was covering them up." And I talked to a friend of mine who was a literal crime scene investigator for the city of Fort Pierce, and I described the situation. Here are the conditions you have found. Here is the lack of evidence. Does this seem suspicious? Does this look like someone trying to something that would plausibly occur from the conditions, or something that would make you suspicious that someone had tried to cover something up? And my friend's like, it's completely plausible that there'd be no prints and no tracks in a situation like that. So, how'd he die? Now, the story that people love is it was murder, most foul, which of course raises the question, well, who done it then? One of the common assumptions is that, well, maybe there was some kind of connection to Judge Chillingworth. He'd been a famous judge down on Palm Beach Island who'd been murdered back in 1955 by another corrupt judge who had hired some hitmen to kidnap him and send him for a swim out there in the Florida Straits. Judge Peel, the corrupt judge, had been tried and convicted in 1961. He was still in jail. There's no actual connection to Trapper. That like Judge Chillingworth and Trapper knew each other. They'd gone after some property sales at the same time. Chillingworth might have surely visited the camp, might have played poker there a time or two, but there's no connection between the two crimes. Although someone decided in a novel in which Trapper features as a character, they decided that they would run with that as the part of the plot. Well, then the next obvious thing is, well, Charlie, Trapper's brother, he was out of prison and he was back for revenge at last. Well, except there's a problem. Charlie, we don't know actually what happened to Charlie. He basically disappears off the map. But he'd been released from prison back in 1951, 17 years before Vince died. Vince was not a hard person to find. He hadn't even left Jupiter. So why wait 17 years for your revenge that you've been plotting for decades in prison, in theory? Not only that, Charlie would have been 70 years old in 1968, and according to his family, the last time they'd seen him, he was an old, broken down man who'd been beaten in prison. He was not someone who's going to sneak up on Trapper Nelson and wrestle his gun away and shoot him. Someone robbing? Well, there was no instance of anything being stolen, so robbery doesn't seem to have any evidence of a motive. Some hoodlum, one of those darn teenagers who's going to prove how tough he is by offing Trapper Nelson. You can't prove how tough you are for offing somebody if nobody ever knows you were the one that offed them. Nobody has ever. I've heard people say, I think my mom or my aunt or my grandma was one of Trapper's lovers. I've never heard anyone come up and go, I think my brother or my uncle was the one who done off Trapper. Is it someone who was, one of those jealous boyfriends, husbands, whatever, that was, thought Trapper had a fling, real or imagined, with their significant other? Maybe, but Trapper's camp had been closed 8 years, as we saw from the photos. By the late 50s, Trapper wasn't the hunk he had been in the 30s. Seems a little late to come around for revenge. Maybe, but nobody's ever really pointed any real suspect there. There was a guy named Pat Snow who was a local banker. I've heard some people suggest that maybe he was into some kind of shady deal, that they didn't trust him. There was another real estate guy named George Offutt, who some people called Awful Offutt. It was the guy who had given Trapper his kind of predatory mortgage for a year. Maybe this is a crooked guy. Maybe he's trying to have Trapper offed for some kind of real estate reason. I've heard one person who says that they think Neil Du Bois, John's brother, was behind the thing, and he was able to get away with it because John was not going to rat out his brother. Really, though, there's no evidence. There's a lot of speculation about who done it, but there's just simply no real evidence that points to any particular suspect. One other possibility is the people who built Jupiter Hills Country Club. Trapper, they wanted to build a country club right on that spot where they ended up building it, but at the time it was part of Jonathan Dickinson State Park, and there was an idea floating around that we found out actually predated Trapper's death, that said, oh well, the state will buy Trapper's property, and he'd been in negotiations with the state to get some kind of life estate on his property, and then the state would get the rest of it for the park. Buy Trapper's property, the developer would, and then they'd swap it for the land that they wanted. Because the state could land swap land of equal value, but they couldn't sell it out right to a developer. It's a motive, but they just ended up working that deal with Trapper's family, and other than the negotiations kind of dragging out a while, if they could have just waited a little while, and probably would have finally worked out a deal with Trapper. So who knows? What about suicide? Because that's the other obvious possibility. Some people have said, oh, well, Trapper doesn't seem like the kind of person to kill himself. There's other people that knew Trapper, and they say Trapper's exactly the kind of person that would kill himself. And I'm inclined to agree that he certainly fits that mold. He's a man who has lived independently on his own for most of his adult life. Someone like that, the thought that someone else is going to have to take care of them, that is that is just a shocking shift of your life and world that you don't want to deal with. And the world is changing very much around Trapper. The Jupiter area is booming. Cuesta is growing. The population is rapidly increasing. The turnpike has come through. Pratt Whitney has been built. Um, it is not the wilderness that Trapper came to. He's still got a nice little area around his camp, but society is closing in. He talked to his family about, oh, maybe I'll sell the camp and I'll go back out west when it's where it's still wild. And I'm like, Vince, you're a little old for that. Um, and I think also people, I think there's a reluctance of people in general to go, oh, a famous figure has died. It must be murder. It must be foul play. They don't want to think that some strong, famous person could ever choose to off themselves. Um, I think a lot of people just don't want to imagine that that ever creeps into someone's mind. We should remember that Trapper was clearly feeling very unwell in the year before his death. Um, that he was in pain and discomfort, afraid of cancer that he may not have actually had, but certainly some kind of health issues. He didn't express depression or anything to his family, but sometimes people who are suicidal, they keep it to themselves and catch people off guard. Um, People say, oh, a shotgun to the chest, that's not the way people kill themselves. And Trapper had a bunch of other guns that would have been easier to use. And it's like, that's very true. But when people do shoot themselves in the chest to kill them, they do it pretty much exactly the way Trapper did it. His family has pointed out that, Trapper, despite his age, he was still a little vain about his appearance and might have been deliberately not shooting himself in the head. Um, the chickens made work of that anyway, but um, people will say, "Oh, well, he was dressed in his clothes that he would go out to town in." You know, surely that someone had ambushed him there, or he was going to leave, and so, or maybe he comes home from town and he's just so exhausted and feeling miserable he just climbs right into this hammock to try to rest, and just he doesn't even change out of anything. Um, People say, "Oh, he couldn't have offed himself the way that they think that he did," and they addressed that specifically in the coroner's inquest. There was a 5'11" deputy that was testifying, and he said, "Yeah, so Trapper puts the butt of the gun on the ground, and leans over. Doesn't even have to use his toe or anything. He just leans over, and with his arms, he could reach down there and push the trigger." And the deputy says, "I can do this with this gun, and I'm 5'11". Trapper was 6'2" and had much longer arms than I do. That was definitely feasible. Um, and then, in addition to all the health issues, the changing world, Captain Frank is dead, all the uncertainty and doubt. His family, I've met his great niece and his great nephew who had both met him and known him. They don't see completely eye to eye on him because they were different ages. One spent much more time with him. One only, knew him up till 6 years old. But both of them have one thing certainly in common besides thinking very well of Trapper. Both of them consider it to be a tragic end, but not a surprising one. They both think it's quite possible that Trapper offed himself. There's, of course, the third option, and there are some people like former Ranger Bob Shue, Frank Lund, uh, who say that, what about an accident? Maybe, the Trapper's not feeling well. He's sleeping in his hammock. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, the guinea fowl freak out about some random wild animal going by. Half awake Trapper, stumbles, grabs for his shotgun, and the gun just goes off and in an accident. It's possible. Probably would never know for sure. It's kind of unprovable one way or the other. The state during the inquest did specifically test the gun to see if it seemed prone to accidental firing and felt that it wasn't. But, accidents are accidents. Sometimes, that happen even though they're not likely. Um, Short of it is, we'll probably never know. Although there is a theory. There's one more theory out there, and it came from a park ranger. And I think it's a really interesting theory we should consider. After all those years, decades of trapping wild animals, one of the raccoons finally got revenge. He had been born in 1906, 1908. So he was almost 60 years old, about 59 and a half. So this is the Lund taken when the Lund family went out to see that a lot of people they get word that Trapper's dead and the camp's been closed for 8 years, and there's just curiosity seekers, people who knew Trapper, people had been there when the camp was still open, people had moved to town and had never been there and just heard the legend of it. They're coming out there to see the place. And this is Trapper's just one of Trapper's wood piles that he'd amassed over the years, all cut by hand by him. Sadly, some of the visitors are not as respectful, which I'll get to in just a moment. So this gives you an idea of just how much he let the camp kind of grow in over 8 years. Very, very almost claustrophobic in places with the tree growth. Not the wide open spaces that it has today or that it had when it was open as a camp. And you can also just see on the left just how many guinea fowl and chickens were hanging around here, having the run of the place. So some of the visitors are curious. In fact, one of them goes, "Oh my gosh, Trapper had gotten rid of all of his animals except for one pen of animals. He still had a pen of gopher tortoises." Because, he'd been there in the 30s and he liked a Hoover chicken as much as anybody else who'd lived through the Depression in Florida. And so they were still there, and one of the people, the curious visitors, releases the remaining gopher tortoises to survive out into the wild. Sadly, people start stealing things. They ransack the cabins. They're looking for money that they think Trapper might have stashed somewhere. They burn down his garage. They sink his boats. They steal his Jeep. There's one other Jeep that was fortunately in town being worked on, and that's the one that's now there at the camp that's been restored. And they make a mess like this photo is. And all this, going on kind of expedites the process of working a deal with the Jupiter Hills Country Club folks. His family would love to hold on to the land, but they can't afford to, and they live up in New Jersey. They work out a deal. The family sells it to the developers. The developers swap. It's about 700. The numbers in here somewhere. They swapped about 700 or 800 acres along the Loxahatchee River from Trapper's Holdings for only 300 acres on US 1, because at the time the US 1 access made the land more valuable than the waterfront property. But so the equal values there were swapped and added to the state park. And then the state park starts policing the camp and making sure there's no more of this. The cabins did survive. There were boxes of Trapper had a whole lot of correspondence he kept with his family, with people he was doing business with, that were in his cabins, and they were all effectively destroyed by the vandals. His trapping records actually did survive and were initially saved by the state park, but then at some point in the 70s or 80s, a careless cleaning out of some of old paperwork resulted in them being thrown away. Here we go. 360 acres in exchange for of sandpine scrub over by US 1 in exchange for 857 acres of Trapper's property. And that is something that number one, they did it because they didn't have any money to buy the land outright. There was no Save Our Rivers, there was no Carl, there was no Florida Forever. All those programs that have added so much to the state park system and to South Florida water management lands in more recent decades just didn't exist yet in 1969. So they had to scramble fast and they didn't have the money. Nowadays, a deal like this wouldn't happen because the sandpine scrub is endangered, and it would, as much as they want to save the river, they'd have to find another way. But nowadays, I think the environmental money would be more likely to be present. 1977, the Trappers Camp will get reopened to the public for visitors. The cabins will be opened a little later. You can no longer drive into the camp like you could in the past. You have to come in by either your own boat, either paddling up from Jonathan Dickinson State Park or downriver from Riverbend Park. And also the tour boat for the park will go up there as long as the tide is high enough. So in 1984, while doing some repair work on Trapper's cabin, It turns out he did have a treasure cache after all. They find a stash in in this chimney, hidden in there behind a loose brick. Uh, 5,000 coins, but they were worth a combined total of about $1,800. It was not gold, it was not silver, it was mostly just normal 20th century American currency. It was just his piggy bank. Again, this is a guy who lived through Depression. You know, you save some under the mattress in case the bank goes bust. Most of these, a few of these were displayed at the camp for a while, and then some of them walked off. So all the remaining coins, which is the majority of them, are up in the state archives. So what is Trapper Nelson's legacy? You know, living legend, great mythic figure, real life mythic figure of the area. But it was that land, he loved the river, and that land he got that, you know, he wasn't sure if he would save it, if he'd give it to his family, if he would let it get sold, but he was trying to work out a deal with the state. And in the end, because of his death, the state acquires that land. And by acquiring that land, it opens up the door 15 years later for the state to acquire all the land along the Loxahatchee River corridor between Trappers Camp and Indian Town Road. Buy it all up from MacArthur and get it to the South Florida Water Management District and preserve that river corridor. If Trappers land is developed, that rest of that river corridor is going to get developed too. And without that river corridor being saved, there is no national wild and scenic river on the Loxahatchee River. So directly or not, Trapper is a big role in saving that river. This is just a general look of the river mileage. The green area is the approximate borders of his property. And then off on the right, marking the Jupiter Hills Country Club over on the far edge, and then the area he owned in Tequesta that he had sold a few years prior to his death. The Selmer family, his relatives, have been great caretakers of his legacy. They come down here and visit often. They have met with us. They've done interviews. They've done tours at the site. They have shared memories. They have shared countless photographs. Jim Snyder has written and repeatedly updated really the only book about Trapper's life and death. Bill and Frank Lund, not only were they instrumental in saving the river, along with the recently deceased Bobby Culpepper, but the Lunds also knew Trapper personally from many visits up to his camp. And so their experiences, their perspective is a valuable insight. The state park maintains it, Trapper Nelson Interpretive Site, on the National Register of Historic Places to this day. Sometimes wish they'd had a little more funding there and a little more staff to keep in a little better shape, but we're grateful that they have maintained that unique part of our history. Three park staff members in particular, all of them retired now. Richard Roberts, Barry Richardson, and Bob Shue were very passionate about the history of the park and especially Trappers Camp, and did a lot to interpret it, to collect its history, and I've enjoyed working with all of them to try to be able to continue preserving this story and be able to share it with you at programs like this. And then we have a lot of collections of photos as part of larger collections of people visiting Trapper, and the state park themselves also have a collection of photos people have given them over the years of Trappers Camp. If you have not read Life and Death on the Loxahatchee, Jim Snyder's book, there is an updated and expanded edition from 2023. That's the latest version you want to get to read. They're always finding out more things, new records and things turning up, new photos to try to more accurately tell the story of Trapper. If you've enjoyed listening to me talk about history, you can hear me talk about more of it up in Hobe Sound Library and at Jupiter Library from now through April, one a month at each location. And then, speaking of the Wild and Scenic River, we have our annual Wild and Scenic Film Festival at the Lighthouse in April. We show a selection of short educational and inspirational environmental films from around the country. It's part of a national film festival. And then we will have Loxahatchee River History Day in May. with programs and panels and so forth about more of our history. If you want to learn ham radio, we got that on the docket. Trying to put together a panel of folks who are at Pratt Whitney to talk about their experiences. So um, I'm happy to answer questions you might have. Yes, ma'am. Earlier on, it was probably three of the palmetto shack type cabins. And then after he went over to the log cabins, it was always just the two big ones that are still there today. We've got a sign that he was charging, it was 25 cents a day to be there at the camp, or 10 cents if you were a kid. I'm not sure what the rate off the top of my head was for the overnight at the cabin. You probably was moving toward that way if you hadn't closed it. Yes, sir. Uh, Probably there would have had to have been for tax purposes, but I don't know offhand. Most of he had a little bit of money in the bank, but mostly it was the value of the land and the site. That was the bulk of his value of what he had. He didn't have electricity out there except from what he got from a small generator he'd have to be able to power things like some of his the saw that the band saw that he had, and the refrigerator, and the water pump. Just some very basic stuff. I don't know one way or the other, but it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. Probably certainly would have had some incentive there to make sure that the boats could turn around, and wouldn't put it past them. And especially sometimes with if there was an inconvenient, he tried to preserve the cypress trees as much as he could, but a cypress stump, a lot of times dynamite is the only way that you're going to get rid of it if it's in the way of what you need. For the annoying goats. So, and assuming that that was true, he certainly had access to dynamite if he blew up the goats. Oh, off the top of my head, I'm not sure. It's not real deep. It's enough you can get a pontoon boat up there at high tide. Um, yeah, offhand, I'm not really sure. It definitely can fluctuate several feet. And it actually, the depth right at his camp is actually not the hardest part to get through. It's the oxbow that's just downriver from his camp that's got the shallowest part. I want to say that sometimes that oxbow is as little as like 3 feet coming through there. So that's your real limit of getting a boat up there. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes, that's in 5,000 Years on the Loxahatchee. So back in 1995, it was the storm of the century here. Um, and the Loxahatchee River was riding so high from the massive amount of rain we had gotten in about a day that the water was up to the top of Trapper's boathouse roof. And an intrepid or crazy group of kayakers decided they would kayak the entire river that day. They had the Eskimo roll to get under the I-95 bridge. Yeah, there's a picture of them with their kayaks sitting on top of the roof of the boathouse. Yeah, something like that. It was here in the Loxahatchee Basin. I up in Martin County. We got that too. I remember trying to get home from school on the bus, and there would be roads where you could see a fence over here and a fence over here, and there was just a river in between.
There was a forest ranger there, a park ranger, who gave us a tour, and it was just incredible. The last few times we've gone, there's no ranger. Do they still come?
Normally when the camp is open to the public, there will be a park staff or a park volunteer there at the camp. to provide a tour and answer questions, especially around the time that the tour boat comes in. Depending on staffing needs, at times they might, I know especially in with the last couple of years, they've had some times where the park was a little short-staffed. So there may occasionally be times where they're a little short-handed there and they may not have someone. But usually when it's open to the public, they want to have someone there, not just to give the tour, but also just for a little bit of security. Because some of the little treasures of Trapper's life have walked off from the camp in the time it's been open to the public, and they really try to prevent that from happening anymore. Yes. I don't know if we have any photos of her out there, but it's quite possible she lived up in Jensen Beach, and it would be not, and she had a boat, so it would be quite likely for her to come down and visit at least once. A lot of the people that were coming were from Palm Beach Island or Jupiter Island, but there were people from farther afar or that were just visiting one of those two places that weren't full-time residents there that would have been coming up to the camp as well. So yeah, certainly likely that Frances would have come up at some point. Not a specific one. It was just more of just a common thing with people with very difficult last names would anglicize them just for ease of operation, also to maybe avoid some prejudice. Some of his family members kept the original Polish name. Charlie and Vince both went over to Nelson, and also some of the members of the family on his uncle's side, the other, his namesake Vincent. Some of that family also changed their name over to Nelson as well. So it's an interesting choice too, because as an ethnic name, I think Nelson is more commonly a Scandinavian name. No, that Ashley's were before his time. John Ashley was killed in 1924, and so Trappers, the earliest he got down here was sometime around 1930. And really, even by the time that Trapper got his camp in 1933, it was like 6 months before Prohibition ended. So he probably didn't deal with that. There was one time actually, I think there was a story from early in his days, and it might be in Jim's book, where they're looking, maybe it wasn't a moonshining deal, maybe it was like some sort of prison escapee or something, but someone, he's out in the woods hunting or trapping, and someone, stumbles across him and tries to arrest him, and another guy comes across and goes, "No, that's not who we're looking for, that's Trapper Nelson." But yeah, so he missed the criminally exciting times of the Ashley gang and Prohibition here. I wouldn't be surprised if up in that neck of the woods on the river there was a bit of moonshining going on, because it would be a good place to keep it quiet from snooping eyes. But before his time. Yeah.
My family lived in Lake Park. We'd go up to Trappers once a month, spend in the guest cabin. The only thing we paid was chocolate cake. He would eat the whole cake. As you said, so true. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. That's actually see it, and it's little tidbits like that. Um, little slices of the life that only people who went there and had that experience can share that, and it's little stories like that. I'm so thankful people share with me and with other historical societies that
Set up the guest cabin so that we could have a hot shower, hot water.
and that I think was primarily for the benefit of his family coming down from New Jersey, who were used to having actual shower, and they were like, "Vince, we'll eat the rattlesnake. We'll try it. We'll have turtle for dinner. We're fine with that. But we could use an actual shower."
If you had a fire in the stove, then that would heat the water, and then you could bring it into the shower. So it was just great,
So just to repeat, just because I want to make sure, since I got the microphone, I want to make sure everyone heard that. So she talks about coming up to stay at Trapper's Camp with her family, and the charge overnight for the guest cabin was a chocolate cake. And to heat the water for the shower, it was actually the stove that heated the water, and the pipe for the shower ran through the stove and heated it up, and that's how you got to have a hot shower. Anybody else? All right. Thank you all for coming.